The galaxy had watched Earth for centuries, ignored, underestimated, dismissed as an insignificant speck of dust in a universe filled with far superior civilizations. But all that changed in an instant. Earth has been invited to participate in the Galactic Soldier Trials, the message read, its words encoded in a way that could only be deciphered by the most advanced alien technology. To humanity, it seemed like a joke. But to the Council of the 12, the invitation was no laughing matter. For the first time in history, an invitation had been sent to Earth, not to trade or to discuss peace, but to test their soldiers in a contest that had seen only the strongest and most ruthless alien species participate. For decades, Earth's military had been focused on securing its borders and advancing technologically, but no one, not even the most seasoned strategists, had ever considered the possibility of standing toe-to-toe with the galactic elite. The invitation wasn't extended out of respect. It was sent because the aliens believed humanity stood no chance. It was the kind of challenge that would either make or break a species. The Galactic Soldier Trials were legendary. Every race that participated had its own brutal trials. Endurance tests that pushed the body past the breaking point, combat simulations that required near-perfect tactics, and intelligence challenges that were designed to crack even the most disciplined minds. Winning wasn't just a matter of pride. It was a declaration of dominance. The Council of the 12 had devised their trials with a singular purpose, to separate the wheat from the chaff, and in their minds, humanity was nothing more than chaff. The human Marines' response. Sergeant Mark Daniels had seen war. He'd been on the front lines of some of the most brutal conflicts Earth had ever faced, each more dangerous than the last. Yet, when the message arrived, he felt his gut twist with unease. He wasn't afraid of the trials themselves. It was the weight of a challenge, the pressure of representing humanity that gnawed at him. Why us? He had asked his superior officer, a question that seemed absurd. Why should Earth even bother? To the Council, they were still primitive, their technology behind most galactic powers. Why would they send Earth to face the galaxy's best and brightest? Why risk the embarrassment of failure? But then he thought about it. The Marines had always been the underdogs. Every battle they fought, every war they won, had been against overwhelming odds. Perhaps, he mused, the invitation was not a mockery, but a test of something more fundamental, the human will to survive. Mark looked at the faces of his squad, standing in front of him in their briefing room. They were all hardened warriors, battle-tested, skilled, and loyal. Each one of them had fought on Earth's most dangerous fronts. And yet, none of them had ever faced a challenge like this. They think we're weak, Mark said, breaking the silence. They think we're nothing. But that's their mistake. Lieutenant Sarah Hayes, a quiet but fierce strategist, nodded. If they think we'll fail, they're in for a shock. But we're not just here to prove them wrong. We're here to show the galaxy exactly what humanity is capable of. The rest of the squad stood straighter, a sense of purpose lighting up their faces. Each one of them knew this wasn't just about individual glory. It wasn't even about their military prowess. This was about survival. Earth's future would be determined in the coming days, and whether humanity would stand as a force to be reckoned with, or fall under the weight of the galaxy's judgment, rested squarely on their shoulders. The team had no illusions about the difficulty of the trials ahead. They'd heard the horror stories, alien soldiers with enhanced strength, intelligence, and centuries of battle experience. Their technology alone could obliterate Earth's defenses in the blink of an eye. They were facing an empire that had crushed entire star systems. But the Marines weren't just facing challenges. They were facing an entire galaxy that had already written them off. Mark turned to his squad, his voice steady but filled with a newfound conviction. We may be outnumbered, outclassed, and outgunned. But we've got something they don't, our humanity. And that's enough. The message from the Council had been clear. If the humans failed, they would be nothing more than a footnote in the galaxy's history. But if they succeeded, they would be a living testament to the strength of the human spirit. And so, with a single resolute nod, Mark Daniels and his Marines prepared for the impossible. The trials were about to begin, and Earth's fate was in their hands. The air was thick with tension as the gates to the Galactic Soldier trials slowly opened. Mark Daniels stood at the front of his squad, his eyes scanning the horizon. They were about to face their first challenge, a brutal, unforgiving endurance test, unlike anything they had ever encountered. A cold wind blew across the alien landscape, and for a moment, Mark almost felt the weight of the galaxy's expectations pressing down on him. But he shook it off. They weren't here to fail. They were here to show the universe that humanity wasn't just a species on the fringes. It was a force to be reckoned with. The challenge ahead was deceptively simple. Run. Run across the entire alien planet surface in less than 12 hours, carrying full combat gear, through environments that could go from frigid to blistering hot in an instant. The terrain was treacherous, frozen cliffs, vast deserts of burning sand, and shifting mountain ranges. The countdown had already begun, and they had no time to waste. Eyes forward, Mark barked, rallying his team. We finish this, or we don't go home. The horn blared, signaling the start of the test. Mark's squad exploded into motion, each Marine keeping pace with the others, their hearts pounding in sync. The first few minutes were straightforward, flat terrain, rocky but manageable. The squad moved as a single unit, their legs pumping with practiced precision. But that was only the calm before the storm. The terrain quickly shifted, becoming more hostile with every step. The ground sloped upward, the air growing thin as they ascended a jagged cliffside. Mark could feel the pressure in his chest, his breath labored, but his mind remained sharp. He had been through worse. His Marines had been through worse. Behind him, Lieutenant Sarah Hayes was already taking charge of the team's pace. She was calculating, precise, and ruthless in her efficiency. If anyone could keep them alive through this, it was her. She had a way of reading the terrain, anticipating the challenges before they even emerged. This is just the beginning, she said over their comms, her voice calm, almost clinical. Keep your bearings. We hit the next checkpoint in 20 minutes. The next challenge came as expected. A violent storm rolled in without warning, a howling gust of wind and snow that reduced visibility to near zero. The Marines tightened their formation, moving forward with determination as the storm battered them from all sides. The conditions were as extreme as the alien species had promised, but this was where Earth soldiers had an advantage. While the aliens had designed the test to push their subjects to the brink, they had underestimated the human spirit. The Marines weren't just trained to survive, they were trained to adapt. Mark felt a sharp tug at his leg. He glanced down to see Private Gregor struggling to keep up, his breath ragged. The weight of his gear was taking its toll, and with the storm obscuring their path, it wasn't hard to see how easily a soldier could falter. Gregor, stay with us, Mark commanded. He dropped back, grabbing the younger man by the shoulder and pulling him forward. Keep moving. We're not losing anyone today. Gregor nodded weakly, but the strain was obvious in his eyes. Mark couldn't afford to let anyone fall behind. Not now. As they reached the top of the next hill, the landscape changed yet again. The storm was gone, but they had entered a vast desert, the sun beating down on them with a cruel intensity. The heat was suffocating, and the sand beneath their boots felt like fire. You got to be kidding me, Private Mills muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. How do they expect anyone to survive this? Mark didn't answer. They had no choice but to keep going. Hours passed, the desert giving way to sharp rocks and brutal winds. It felt like they were being tested not just physically, but mentally. Every mile, every step was designed to wear them down, to make them question their very will to survive. We're close, Sarah said, her voice cutting through the pain. We've got this. But just as hope seemed within reach, a new challenge emerged. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and a deep rumble echoed through the desert. Mark's eyes darted to the horizon. There in the distance, a massive sandstorm was brewing, moving fast, and closing in on them. The Marines had no choice but to push forward. They could feel the weight of the trial, the eyes of the galaxy watching, waiting for them to fail. But they wouldn't. Not today. As the storm approached, Mark took a deep breath and gave the order to sprint. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about proving the impossible could be done. The sandstorm roared in behind them, but they pushed through, their minds focused on the single goal: finishing this test. They had come too far to let a mere storm stop them. And when they crossed the final checkpoint, the weight of their achievement hit them like a wave. For a moment, the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath. They had done it. They had survived the first trial. But in the distance, the Council of the 12 looked on, their expressions unreadable. This was just the beginning. The real test had yet to come. The moment they stepped into the next arena, it became clear. The physical trials were over. There would be no more running, no more sprinting across alien landscapes. What awaited them now wasn't just a test of body, it was a test of mind. The Galactic Soldier Trials had been designed by a council of species whose technological and intellectual superiority was unmatched. And today, the Marines would face their greatest challenge, yet a series of strategic and mental puzzles that would push them to their limits. This is where we separate the warriors from the thinkers, Mark Daniels muttered under his breath, his gaze hardening as he surveyed the room. The arena was a vast, sterile chamber, its walls covered in strange symbols and shifting holograms. It was a maze of puzzles, each one more complex than the last. The first challenge was projected onto the central screen, a tactical combat simulation, with ever-changing scenarios that demanded immediate decision-making. Sarah Hayes, the squad's tactical mastermind, stepped forward. Her calm demeanor never wavered, even as the challenge began. "It's a pattern," she said, her voice low. "We just need to figure out how they're setting the scenarios. There's always a weakness." The simulation started immediately, flooding their minds with images of different combat situations. Alien soldiers appeared on the screen, their movements precise, calculated, and unerringly efficient. The Marines had to outthink them at every turn. But the puzzle wasn't about brute force or reaction time. It was about strategy. Each team of aliens attacked in waves, but they adapted to the Marines' counterattacks. The moment the squad thought they had a solution, the simulation shifted. New enemies appeared, new challenges emerged, and new weaknesses were revealed. "We need to predict their moves, not just react," Sarah said, tapping away at her wrist console, her eyes never leaving the screen. "The key is to understand the AI's programming. If we can read it, we can win." Hours passed as the squad battled against the virtual enemies, their minds churning with constant calculations. Mark felt the weight of the task pressing on his shoulders. Every decision, every move felt like it could be the difference between success and failure. And yet, they pushed forward. But then, the first crack appeared. Private Mills, normally one of the most reliable Marines, hesitated. He was overthinking his next move, trying to anticipate too many variables. The AI caught on, and the simulation shifted again, taking advantage of his indecision. Sarah saw the mistake immediately. "Mills, focus on the basics. Don't get lost in the details." It was a simple correction, but it was enough to get Mills back on track. The Marines worked together, adjusting to the AI's relentless pressure. They began to predict its moves, to anticipate what the simulation would throw at them next. Just as they thought they had the upper hand, the simulation threw a new curveball. A countdown began on the screen. 30 minutes. 20. 10. The AI had set a trap. A bomb was planted in the middle of the battlefield, and the countdown was rapidly approaching zero. The Marines had to disable it, but doing so meant diverting their focus from the alien soldiers. "Mark, we have to split up," Sarah said, her eyes sharp. "We need to divide and conquer." Mark hesitated for a moment, but he knew it was the only way. He nodded, his voice steady. "Do it." The squad split into smaller units, each tasked with either neutralizing the bomb or holding off the alien soldiers. Time seemed to slow down as the countdown ticked away. Sweat beaded on Mark's forehead as he watched the seconds dwindle. Private Gregor was the first to reach the bomb. His hands shook as he worked to disarm it, but his training kicked in, and the Marines on his team kept the enemy soldiers at bay. 5 seconds. Mark could barely breathe as he watched the final moment unfold. With a loud click, The bomb was deactivated, and the simulation abruptly ended. The room went silent, and for a moment, Mark felt like they were back on Earth. But then the walls began to shift, and the next puzzle appeared. The Marines had passed the test, but only just. And the Council of Alien Overseers was watching every move, their eyes cold and calculating. It wasn't just the physical tests that would determine their worth. It was their ability to outthink, outlast, and adapt in the face of overwhelming odds. Mark exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the trial settle over him. They had won this round, but they were far from finished. The real battle for survival had only just begun. It didn't matter how many alien species had faced the trials before them. Nothing could prepare them for this. The Marines stood in a dark, cold chamber, the air thick with a strange electric hum. A mechanical voice echoed through the space, reverberating off the walls. "Welcome to your final test." Mark Daniels' stomach tightened. He knew what was coming. They'd faced physical endurance, battle tactics, and mental puzzles. But now they would face something far worse: psychological warfare. The lights flickered and the room shifted. Suddenly, images flashed before their eyes, scenes of their worst fears, their deepest regrets. Mark's chest tightened as the images blurred into memories he'd long buried. It was his worst nightmare. He stood on the battlefield, watching helplessly as his squad was wiped out. The screams echoed in his mind, each one a reminder of the sacrifices he had made. He had failed them. He had failed his team. He forced the thoughts away. He had to stay focused. The trial was designed to break them mentally, to expose their vulnerabilities, but they couldn't give in. Not now. Beside him, Lieutenant Sarah Hayes grimaced. Her face was pale, but she kept her focus, eyes locked on the center of a room where a massive hologram now projected itself. The image was a distorted version of herself, a version that blamed her for every mistake, every soldier she'd lost on past missions. "I can't do this," Sarah murmured, shaking her head. "I've failed them all." Mark's eyes flickered to her, his voice low but firm. "Sarah, we all carry ghosts. Don't let them control you. You're not alone in this." But Sarah's eyes didn't meet his. Her face twisted in anguish, and the hologram in front of her shifted, feeding off her doubt. It grew larger, more menacing, until it towered over her. The trial wasn't just about surviving. It was about confronting the darkest corners of their own minds. Private Gregor was next. His body jerked as a flash of light engulfed him. He fell to his knees, hands clutching his head as he screamed. Mark wanted to run to him, but he knew better. The trial wasn't physical. It was a test of will. Gregor's fear manifested as a monstrous version of his childhood, the sight of an abusive father looming over him. He had never spoken of his past, but now it was laid bare for everyone to see. "I'm not weak," Gregor choked out, his voice trembling, but he refused to look away. Slowly, his body straightened. He clenched his fists and stood tall, forcing the image to shrink. He wasn't that boy anymore. He was a Marine, and nothing would break him. But the trial wasn't over. The room shifted again, and Mark's breath hitched as a new image appeared before him. This time, it was his mother, standing alone, her face a mask of disappointment. The voice that came from her lips wasn't hers at all. It was the voice of every commander who had ever doubted him, every superior who had questioned his decisions. "You're not good enough," the voice taunted. "You'll never measure up. You're a failure." Mark's hands clenched into fists, his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to scream, to shatter the illusion, but he knew it was a lie. He had fought too hard to let this trial defeat him. "You're wrong," he whispered to himself, his voice shaky but determined. "I am enough." Slowly, the hologram of his mother faded, replaced by the harsh reality of the chamber. The Marines stood alone, their breaths shallow, their minds rattled. But they had survived. "We're not broken," Sarah said, her voice steadier now, her expression hardening as the last of the images faded. "We're still here." Mark nodded, his heart still racing. The trial had been designed to shatter them, but they had held firm. It wasn't just physical strength or intellect that would win these trials. It was their ability to endure, to face down their own demons and rise above them. The mechanical voice returned, cold and unfeeling. You have passed this stage. But the trials are far from over. The Marines stood in silence for a moment, each of them grappling with the aftermath of their own personal battle. The images had been cruel, but they had fought through them. They had proven something to themselves and to the galaxy. But the weight of the trials was far from lifted. They knew this was only the beginning. The final stage awaited them. If they could survive the psychological manipulation, could they endure what was yet to come? "Let's move," Mark said, his voice calm but resolute. "We have more trials ahead, and we're not stopping until we finish them all." The squad nodded in unison, their resolve solidified. No matter what came next, they would face it together. Their strength wasn't just in their bodies or minds. It was in their unity, their refusal to give up. They had been tested in ways no one had ever thought possible. But they would endure. And when the final trial came, they would stand tall, together. The air in the chamber was thick with anticipation, but this time, the Marines were ready. They had survived the brutal trials of physical endurance, the mental mazes, and the most haunting psychological tests. But nothing could have prepared them for what came next. A low hum echoed through the room, and the walls began to shimmer, transforming into a new, unsettling environment. The Marines were no longer in the sterile testing facility they had come to expect. This time, the arena was a vast, empty expanse, desolate, cold, and silent. The ground beneath their boots was cracked and dry, like a forgotten battlefield. Mark Daniels' gaze hardened as he surveyed the landscape. "This is it," he muttered, his voice grim. "This is the final test." Without warning, the ground beneath their feet shifted. Massive cracks appeared, and from the depths of the earth, dark shapes began to emerge, alien soldiers, but not like any they had seen before. These were enhanced, their forms monstrous and unpredictable, a chilling amalgamation of organic and mechanical parts. Each one looked more menacing than the last. The aliens attacked without hesitation, and the Marines were thrown into the thick of the fight. Mark moved quickly, assessing the situation. The enemies were relentless, each strike faster and more brutal than the last. These weren't just enemies, they were designed to push the Marines past their breaking point. "This is a simulation," Sarah Hayes said, her voice sharp but steady, trying to keep her team focused. "They're trying to break our strategy. Don't fight like we did before. Adapt." The squad quickly fell into formation, each member taking a defensive stance, aware that their only chance was to stay coordinated. The alien soldiers seemed to anticipate their every move, adjusting their tactics to exploit any weakness. The intensity was overwhelming. Mark's heart raced as he locked eyes with Sarah. They knew what was at stake. This was more than just a test of strength. It was a test of everything they had learned about themselves, about the Marines they had become. They couldn't afford to falter. They couldn't let doubt creep in. The fight raged on, but despite their best efforts, the Marines were pushed back. The enemies were too powerful. The aliens adapted too quickly. Mark saw Gregor stagger as a blow landed too close to his side. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't fall. "We need to change the game," Sarah said, her voice laced with urgency. "We can't keep fighting like this." Mark nodded. It was time to think outside the box, to tap into the resilience that had gotten them this far. He glanced around, seeing the environment shifting again, the ground splitting open to reveal even more alien forces. The Marines were being surrounded. "There's no way out," Gregor said through clenched teeth. "We're surrounded." But Mark had an idea. They had faced impossible odds before. This time, it wasn't about defeating the enemies head-on. It was about using the environment to their advantage. "Sarah, cover the left flank. Mills, Gregor, take the high ground. We're going to fight smarter, not harder," Mark ordered, his voice commanding. The squad immediately responded, taking positions as the aliens closed in. Mark's plan wasn't perfect, but it was the only chance they had. They weren't fighting just to survive now, they were fighting to win. The alien soldiers adjusted their strategy once more, but they were too late. The Marines had already shifted the battlefield in their favor. As they drew the enemies into a corner, they unleashed a devastating coordinated strike, forcing the aliens into retreat. For a moment, the chamber went silent. The sounds of battle stopped, and the Marines stood victorious, breathing heavily, their bodies bruised but unbroken. But the silence was short-lived. The mechanical voice of the trial system echoed through the room once again. Congratulations, Earth soldiers. You have survived, but survival is not enough. Mark's heart sank. They had won this round, but the trial was far from over. The voice continued. Now you will face the final test. You will be judged not on your physical strength, your intelligence, or your ability to adapt, but on your ability to lead. The ground began to tremble again, and the Marines readied themselves for whatever was coming next. They had fought for survival, fought for each other, but now they would be tested on their ability to unite, to lead their squad to victory when the stakes were higher than ever before. Mark clenched his fists. He had faced countless battles, countless challenges, but this was the ultimate test, not just to survive, but to command. And as the final trial began, Mark knew one thing for certain. The real war had only just begun. Mark Daniels had fought wars, survived endless battles, and stared down death more times than he could count. But nothing could prepare him for what stood before him now. The arena was silent, eerily so. The air hung heavy with the tension of 1,000 eyes, unseen but ever present. Mark's squad, battered but unbroken, stood together, each of them eyeing the center of the arena where a new challenge awaited them. A test unlike any they had faced before. The ground trembled, and the walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Then, a new presence appeared before them. A holographic projection shimmered to life, towering over the Marines, a massive figure draped in shadow, with an aura of unimaginable power. The figure spoke, its voice deep and resonating. "You have come far, Earth soldiers," it said, its tone both mocking and admiring. "But you are not yet worthy. You will face the ultimate trial, leadership." Mark's chest tightened. This wasn't a test of strength or intellect. It was a test of their unity, their ability to command and guide one another in the face of impossible odds. The Marines weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for each other, for the future of humanity. The hologram raised a hand, and the ground beneath their feet began to shift. In an instant, the environment around them morphed into a battlefield, an alien war zone, ravaged by constant conflict. The Marines stood at the center, surrounded by enemies they couldn't see, enemies that would test not just their combat skills, but their ability to hold their team together. "You will lead your squad," the figure continued, "and if you fail, it will not only be your lives at stake, but the fate of your entire species." Mark's heart pounded. This was it. There were no more tricks, no more tests. If they didn't succeed here, everything they had fought for, everything they had endured, would mean nothing. "We stand together," Mark said, his voice firm as he addressed his squad. "We've made it this far because we fought as one. And that's how we'll win this. Together." The squad nodded, each of them steeling themselves for the unknown. The challenge ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain. They had no choice but to trust in each other. In this trial, their individual strengths and weaknesses would be tested, but it was their collective spirit that would determine their success. The battle began without warning. Alien soldiers appeared from every direction, fast, intelligent, and relentless. But the Marines didn't flinch. They moved in perfect sync, covering each other's weaknesses, anticipating the enemy's every move. Mark's mind raced as he assessed the situation, calling out orders and adapting the strategy as the battle evolved. "Sarah, take the high ground. Mills, cover the rear. Gregor, you're with me, front and center. Let's keep the pressure on them." The squad moved as one, fluid and precise. But with every alien they took down, two more seemed to appear. The enemies adapted quickly, forcing the Marines to constantly change tactics. The weight of their decisions felt heavier with each passing second. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation, could cost them everything. The holographic figure watched from a distance, its silence unnerving. Mark could feel the presence of the trial system, judging every decision, every action. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for humanity's place in the galaxy. Time seemed to stretch as the battle wore on, but Mark didn't let up. He couldn't afford to. His squad was depending on him, and he wasn't about to let them down. He had led them this far, and he would lead them through to the end. "Push forward," Mark shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We're not stopping until we win this." In the final moments of the trial, when it seemed like the enemy had them cornered, Mark made a bold move. He directed the squad into the heart of the battlefield, drawing the alien forces into a trap. The enemy forces followed, confident they had won, but Mark's Marines had already set the stage for their final strike. With a single coordinated effort, the Marines overwhelmed the remaining enemies, pushing them back with a force they couldn't match. The hologram flickered and vanished. The silence in the arena was deafening. Then the mechanical voice of the trial system echoed through the chamber. "Congratulations, Earth soldiers. You have passed the final test." Mark exhaled, the weight of the trial lifting from his shoulders. The squad stood together, bruised and battered, but victorious. They had proven themselves no longer just survivors, but leaders. They had faced the impossible and come out on top. Mark looked at his squad, his family. "We did it," he said, a small, tired smile tugging at his lips. "We're ready." And with that, the Marines of Earth had earned their place among the stars.